Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another video. This one on the modern world's problems as it relates to social and environmental problems in the world that we live in today, in the contemporary world. So, the first social problem that we have to deal with is poverty. And so we're going to look at a couple of different dimensions of poverty. Make sure if this video is useful to you, make sure if you like this video that you hit like, hit subscribe to get notifications for when the new videos go up. Leave a comment if you have a question or feedback that you'd like to give me. And let's move on into poverty here. So the first thing we're looking at is, of course, conditions in poverty. This particular slum is actually technically a favela because it is in Latin America. This one is from Rio de Janeiro, and the slum itself, the favela itself, is called Rosina. So one of the things we can see here is that the living conditions in a place like this are really absolutely abysmal. Huge population densities. These places have been cobbled together. They're not centrally planned. They don't necessarily have streets that you can get a fire truck down. Things like disease would spread through these areas, incredibly quickly and incredibly efficiently. And we see these favelas exist all over the place throughout the entire developing world. Favelas and slums are a relatively common occurrence. Of course, a major issue here is the disposal of waste and trash. A lot of these slums and favelas grow out of garbage dumps because, of course, people have resources freely available to them in order to produce not only the homes that they live in, but also their clothing and also their food. And it provides people an opportunity to really have resources at their disposal, which they can, afford a living out of. The concerning part, of course, is that's also a huge challenge to things like hygiene and containing the spread of diseases and proper nutrition and things like that. This is a reality of life for huge numbers of people in the world, and the estimates are it could be as many as 1 billion people on Earth today in 2020 live in some sort of slum conditions. As an extension of that, one of the really concerning parts, not only about favelas, but also about people who are living in global poverty anyway, is the availability of clean, fresh water. We really see that clean, fresh water is a major issue and a major concern. And of course, one of the groups of people that is most at risk of lacking clean, fresh water is children living in poverty. Children living in poverty, of course, is just absolutely heartbreaking, and it's the truth of life for a large number of people. Now, one of the things that's important to understand here is, what does global poverty actually mean? Because living in the Western world, of course, we have a lot of benefits that other people in the developing world do not have. We have social safety nets like welfare and SNAP and food assistance programs and housing assistance programs, things like that. What does it mean to live in global poverty? Well, as of right now, today in 2020, the global poverty line, to be considered to actually live in global poverty, an individual person has to live on less than $1.25 American per day. And that $1.25 is necessary for them to cover their basic living expenses. So shelter and food and clothing and medical care and everything else comes down to if you make less than $1.25 a day. Now, 2019 was actually a really humongous year because one of the things that's really excellent about 2019 is, for the first time in all of human history, the global poverty rate was in the single digits. We actually hit about 8.9% global poverty rate. And that's the first time in history we've done that. Now, of course, in 2020, because we've had some situations crop up that are going to seriously impact global poverty, my expectation is we're going to be back up into the double digits again, at least for the foreseeable future. But global poverty is something which has been declining. Now, as an extension of that, of course, we see this particular map shows us that, of course, not all poverty is geographically uniformly distributed. Here we can see this particular map is an indirect measurement of poverty, because this map shows us the percentage of the populations of the country that are undernourished. They are not getting sufficient calorie intake per day to sustain themselves. And so, of course, we see the global south, of course, suffers much worse than the global north. And of course, we talked about the global south before, but the global south, Africa, the central part of South America, central, south, East Asia, places like that. The risk of having undernourishment there is really incredibly high when you think about, the development that's going on in the modern world. This particular map also shows us an extension of that, and this looks at the mean life expectancy. So what that means is a baby born today in one of these countries, what is the average life expectancy that baby can expect to live? So on average, how long do people live that are born, today? If we look at a country like the United States, of course, we have a very high life expectancy. Ours is between 74.7 and 77.1. So a baby born today in 2020 is expected to live somewhere about 75 to 77 years. That's a really long time. And you have to remember that's an average. So that doesn't mean that most people die when they're 75. What that means is half the people will live longer than that, half the people will live shorter than that. And one of the really important things to realize is that means that most people that die in the United States die in their elderly years. We have very, very, very few children die. And to think about this life expectancy thing, we should look at sub-Saharan Africa. We should look at the southern part of Africa there when we see, countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has a mean life expectancy of between 32.7 and 41.4 years. Now, what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean you're an old person when you're 37. It doesn't mean that most people die when they're 40. What it means is there is some mechanism by which that average is being pulled down. And I want you guys to think about it in terms of grading math. If you are doing pretty well in a class and you get 1-0, think about what that 1-0 does to your overall grade in the class. It massively pulls it down. Well, when it comes to life expectancy, we can see a very, very similar trend when it comes to infant mortality, children dying. When children die in their very, very, very young years, right? And again, some of these places in sub-Saharan Africa have infant mortality rates similar to what we would have seen in the West before the Industrial Revolution and before the Agricultural Revolution. We're talking about 50% mortality rates. Half of the babies that are born are going to die before their 5th birthday. If you have a child that dies in 3 months worth of life, it's basically like getting a 0 on a test or on an assignment in a class, where it massively pulls down your overall average. Once people live into adulthood, once you reach 10, 11, 12, 15 years old, the possibility and probability that you're going to live to be 70 or 80 years old is really good in all of the countries in the world. But the problem in the countries with really low mean life expectancies are their infant mortality rates are usually extremely high. Coupled with that fact, we also see that their birth rates also tend to be really, really high too. And so we get that pyramid, that social pyramid, that age-based cohort pyramid, where the base of young children is very, very wide and older people get narrower and narrower and narrower. And again, we looked at that in one of the previous videos. So again, we can see the impact of global poverty directly on people's lives just when it comes to how long do people live and how do their living conditions impact their average lifespan. Now, here's the good news, and this really is good news. This chart, this graph, shows us global poverty rates from 1820 to 2005. And one of the things to notice is the downward slope, but not just the downward slope. If you'll notice, since 1950, that downward slope has been accelerating in its negative growth. And so really what we're looking at here is if you think about 1820, we're talking about the beginning phase of the second part of industrialization. We're talking about the professionalization of the disciplines and the solving of the problems of the initial phase of industrialization and urbanization, and water treatment plants and sewer treatment plants, and we're starting to develop medical technologies that reduce the death rate. And so ultimately, one of the things that we see as a result of that increased production and efficiency is in about 1820, you're talking about globally somewhere between 85 and 90% of all people living on Earth live in global poverty. 85 to 90% of people living in poverty. Now, when we see today, right, 2019, I gave you guys the statistic before that in 2019, that number hit the single digits. We were down to about 8.9% before the current crisis hit. And that's the first time in all human history that we had single digits globally of people living in poverty. This isn't in a country. This isn't just in the United States or in Europe or places like that. This is across the entire world. Less than 10% of the people across the entire world before our current crisis were living in global poverty. Now, what does this tell us? How should we interpret this? Well, if we think about it, since 1820, the thing that has most impacted the way that people on Earth live and the way we produce things, and particularly the way that we produce food, has been the industrial and agricultural revolutions. Those two factors have combined together to massively, massively, massively decrease global poverty. It's not that poverty is not a problem. It's not that it's not a problem, a huge problem in some parts of the world, but overall, the solution to global poverty in the long term has been industrialization and capitalism and increasing the efficiency of our economic production to massively decrease global poverty rates. This is also one of the things to remember about communism and socialism. Communism and socialism were created in the 1830s and 40s, and if we look back there, the reason that they were so appealing is because so incredibly many people were living in abject poverty. Today, when people talk about socialism, what they have to realize is socialism was designed to solve problems that no longer exist. In the old days, of course, socialism was all about the redistribution of bread. Everything was about bread and redistributing food and making sure that people had sufficient food. Well, in the modern world, the poorest people actually suffer the highest rates of obesity. So, in fact, we have flipped that problem of socialism, or that socialism was designed to address, completely and totally on its head. The world is a completely and totally different place than it was 200 years ago, when global poverty was, again, between 85 and 90%. And again, for pretty much all of human history, that's the way that it was. 85 to 90% of all human beings on Earth lived in abject poverty for the entire span of our history. It's only an incredibly recent development that we've gotten that problem of global poverty under control. Okay, so there's our poverty situation. We now want to look at some natural disaster problems. So one of the things that globally we've been dealing with is people who live in poverty also tend to live along the coastlines, and that's actually starting to really give us some problems because of the increasing population that's living in these particular regions. So one example of this is on December the 26th, 2004, underwater, off the coast of the island nation of Indonesia, we got a massive earthquake. Now, when the earth shook, it also shook the water that was sitting on top of it. So think about it kind of like a Jell-O mold, if you've ever seen a Jell-O mold. If you shake that plate, it also shakes all of the Jell-O up, on the top of it. Now, out in the middle of the ocean, this isn't a really big issue, right? It creates what is called a tsunami, and of course tsunamis are dangerous, and we know that, but we also have very bad misconceptions for what a tsunami is. Most people think that a tsunami is one wave that's 300 feet tall and maybe 50 feet wide that washes up on shore and knocks over buildings, and it's just a horrible, awful, terrible event, but it's over relatively quickly. In actuality, a tsunami is actually only a wave. It's one wave, but it's only about 6 feet tall, but it's 25 miles long. So that water continues to come up on shore and pile up and back up rivers and back up sanitation systems and really just massively flood these particular areas. When you get this happening in a place like Indonesia or India or Bangladesh or Kenya and Tanzania and Somalia, right? These are places that have enormous rates of poverty. And of course, the people who live right on the coastline are at enormous risk from these naturally occurring disasters. But it's not just the people living in the developed world. We also saw on March the 11th, 2001, off the coast of the country of Japan, we had a massive 9.0 underwater earthquake. And actually, when this earthquake went off, it threw a tsunami towards the island nation of Japan. Now, the good news is Japan is a developed country. They have tsunami detectors and earthquake detectors, and they have good building codes and building standards, and Japan is a country that should be able to withstand an awful lot of natural disasters that they actually specifically plan for. Now, the problem with this particular earthquake is, however, when the wave came on shore, it washed up and ruined a couple of electric generators in a nuclear power plant, which was called the Fukushima Daiichi power plant. When those electrical generators were forced offline, the problem became that nuclear reactors work off of heat. The nuclear reaction generates lots and lots of heat, and the reactor itself is actually under a pool of water. And when the reactor heats up, the water heats up and produces steam, and then that steam is used to spin a wheel, and that wheel essentially becomes like the old steam engine, where you can extract large amounts of energy out of it just because the steam is going through and turning what's called a turbine. It's not actually called a wheel, it's called a turbine. Well, to keep a nuclear reactor from getting out of control and melting down, one of the things you have to do is you have to constantly circulate the water in the pool in order to keep the reactor cool. The problem with this particular reactor was the electrical generators that run the water pumps to keep the reactor core cool were parked right next to the shoreline, and when the tidal wave came on, it ruined those electrical generators and it shut off the pumps. And when that happened, the heat continued to build up, as well as the hydrogen gas that continued to build up inside of the reactor core, to the point where it actually experienced what we call a meltdown. A meltdown means that the core material, the nuclear fuel and the casing and everything on the inside of that melts and fuses and starts tunneling its way down towards the center of the Earth. Now, this particular reactor that melted down, and there's actually two reactors that melted down, didn't just tunnel towards the center of the Earth. It actually kind of went in the it's almost like a lava flow. It's a material called corium, because it's the core that's all fused together. The corium actually rode down the concrete casing of the reactor itself, almost like a water slide, and actually it tunneled its way out through that concrete casing. And unfortunately, this is not a natural, well, it's a natural disaster that produced one of the worst man-made catastrophes of all time, which was that corium actually made it into the ocean and started to contaminate the ocean and the water around Japan. And of course, we can see that this contamination has continued to spread. Now, we're talking about enormous quantities of water. So if I'm swimming off the coast of California or off the coast of Peru, it's not really the radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi plant that we got to worry about. But of course, the closer you get to Japan, the more of a concern this is. So of course, this is a natural disaster that also helped to set off a man-made catastrophe, and something which, again, in the modern world, it's something we have to be cognizant of and understand that these are things that actually happen. Next, we see, of course, another social and environmental problem, which is, of course, the problem of refugees. Right now in the world, there are somewhere around 15.2 million people who are refugees. Refugees are people who are displaced from their homes. They have to leave their homes in order to avoid war, conflict, genocide, whatever is going on in their home country, which is not a favorable thing for them to live with. We consider those people to be refugees. And the really sad part about it is 2/3 of those refugees are from only 6 countries in the world: Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Somalia, Sudan, Colombia. In addition, today we could add another country to that list, which would be Venezuela. Contributes a very large number of refugees as well. Now, the last social and environmental problem that the world is experiencing right now, we've got a couple that are related to each other. One problem is mass extinctions. We have seen since the beginning of the 20th century the rate at which not only human populations increase, but also the rate at which animal species go extinct has been massively and exponentially growing. As the human population gets bigger, our demand for resources gets bigger. As our demand for resources gets bigger, we need to consume more and more of the natural environment to be able to provide for ourselves. One way and one method that this happens is through a process that we call deforestation. Particularly, we see this in places like the Amazon rainforest, where the country of Brazil needs more farmland and they need more ranching land to be able to feed their growing population. So they go to the Amazon rainforest, they hack it down, they start planting farms, they start developing ranching land to raise cows. Now, this has actually a double effect, which is a negative effect on the global environment. One problem, of course, is just the loss of rainforest environment in and of itself. The other problem, of course, is that rainforests especially are just chock full of plant material. And the great part about plants is they absorb carbon dioxide and they produce oxygen. Now, in addition to that, of course, they also have enormous biodiversity and they're beautiful, natural and pristine places that ultimately should be preserved to the largest extent possible. However, there's also this problem of, as we continue to burn forests, and as those forests continue to have a reduced capacity to absorb carbon, one of the things we've seen is an increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And that carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. And what that means is that as greenhouse gases continue to increase in level in the atmosphere, those greenhouse gases are absorbers of heat and of solar radiation, and that helps to elevate the temperature of Earth, the average global temperature of Earth, right? It's all about the heat cycle and the water cycle and how that heat is being held and retained. Now, I'm actually not going to get to the point where we're going to deal with global warming, but one of the things to realize here is that when we look at global climate change over a long enough period of time, not only can we see that the global climate has changed and does change considerably over very long periods of time, but also, if you'll notice, the world right now, in the last 50,000 years, we are actually coming out of an ice age. So, the idea that the globe never changes is wrong. The idea that, over long periods of time, the globe, stays relatively consistent is something which, it's very centric to human lifespans. The globe does change. Do human beings contribute to that? I would say probably so, but again, I'm going to leave that to the scientists and to the ecologists and to the climatologists and that sort of thing. So I hope this video was good for you. If it was informative, please leave a like. Also subscribe for notifications when the new videos go up. We've got 2 videos left in this particular course. For the next video, we're going to look at security in the modern world, and then we're going to end up dealing in the last video with modern science and technology. So thanks for your attention. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.